Hello everybody and welcome to another video, and in this video we're going to talk about Compendium scrolls. We're going to talk about that section of the book past chaos and death, and we're going to get into how do we tackle the problem, quote unquote, of Compendium scrolls. This has come up recently as a large topic of discussion of what to do with these old armies and old special characters and things like that. It's gone around in the community, and I have some ideas on what I think could be a very positive way forward for us as a community and, for Games Workshop. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about some of the ways we could deal with them that I don't like, and ultimately what I think the solution is in this video. I hope that you agree with me, or at the very least I give you some food for thought. So come along on a little journey with me through Compendium scrolls. And of course, leave your own ideas down below, because I certainly don't think that I have the only answer here, or that I'm necessarily 100% right. But I do think it's something to get the conversation started. So I'd love to see your thoughts below. And of course, this is a response video to my own topic of the week, because, why not be a snake eating its own tail? So let's get into it. All right, so what's the issue? First, let's chart out the issue. So, Compendium scrolls, what are they? Well, they're the collection of out-of-print armies and special characters, that are dead, or in the narrative, that is to say, they lived in the past. Not that that really matters. But they're basically out of print, that being the main concern. And I have this sort of divided into two categories here, okay? The left is sort of the pros, and the right is sort of the cons. And I think it's important to realize that both of these are compelling. Maybe they're not equally compelling to you, but what you have to accept is that they are compelling to people. That's why this is being discussed. So simply saying, I don't think it's a problem, hence we don't have to worry about it, isn't a fair answer. Because there are people who do think this is a problem. And I think that's why it deserves discussion. If you're cool with it, that's cool. And there's no problem with that. Good, you've come down on thinking that the left column weighs a lot more than the right. But the fact that it has engendered so much discussion tells me that not everybody agrees with you, and we should probably talk about it. So, on the left, what do we got? What's important about these Compendium scrolls? Well, obviously, at the core, they represent characters and armies that people really love. These armies have fans. These characters have fans, right? These minis have heart and soul and love invested into them. And that leads me right to the second point, which is they represent massive collections people have, right? And so when you think about, say, take somebody like me, for example. That's an easy one. I have 12,920 points of painted Tomb Kings. I love my Tomb Kings. I bought that army book when it was released in 2004, and I've loved it ever since, even when they sucked, all throughout the years. And they're the best they've ever been. By the way, side funny, ironic note, the Bretonnians and the Tomb Kings are literally the best they've been in decades, and now people are complaining and want to get rid of them. Thank you. Thank you very much. I had to wait 13 years for my armies to be good, and now you want to kill it. Deeply appreciated. So, at any rate, this is an investment, and people have these figs, and they want to play with them, which there's nothing wrong with that, right? People want to use their toys. Yeah, of course. That's fine. But also, these scrolls have some unique rules and enable some cool armies. And the last bullet point to me on the left is the most important, okay? And I want you to really internalize and think deeply about this. When they came for the Bretonnians and the Tomb Kings, I did not object because I did not have Bretonnians or Tomb Kings. What you have to understand is that these Compendium scrolls will grow over time. Period. Full stop. Okay? They will. Because as new armies are consistently released, they cannot keep everything in print forever. That was one of the problems that they ran into in the old game. So they will shuffle old things off into the Compendium. And so even if you don't care about the armies or the characters that are in there now, some of the things you love and play with could end up there in the future. So we better solve this problem in a way that works for everyone. Because If you say, well, let's just get rid of it, and then 2 years from now, it's your stuff that ends up in there, I doubt you're going to take the same opinion. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. But it certainly will be a different world for you. Okay. So what are the challenges? Well, Warhammer TV records a lot of tournaments now. They're participating in, a lot of sort of GTs and stuff, like, Las Vegas Open and the recent Masters and South Coast GT and all this thing. And when they record these and show these, people see these armies, if they win, as TK did in the last Masters, right? Then those people can't go buy that army. A lot of Age of Sigmar has brought a lot of new blood into the game, and the reality is that all of a sudden I'm going to go to the Warhammer website when I see that army win, because I don't know the history of it. I just started playing 2 months ago, but I saw this sweet army of chariots and cool sphinxes and stuff. I want to get that army, and I go to the website and it's nowhere to be found. That's not a great experience, right? Now, let me put a very fine point on this, because I really, really, really want to emphasize this. No part of what I'm talking about here with the issues has been raised by Games Workshop or any of its employees. This isn't insider information or anything like that. Okay? I'm just predicting what I see as a problem. They have said nothing but these things will remain legal and they'll be around. I don't know if will be the case. I don't know what they think. I have no idea. But what I do know is that if I was them, I would see this as a problem. Okay? So there we go. All right. So this has all come up because of, this all kind of kicked off when the South Coast GT, which is hosted by Dan Heelan and his crew, put out their initial sort of tournament rules and said that Compendium scrolls were going to be banned. And a lot of discussion happened around that. Now, they ended up backing off that, okay, and allowing tournament scrolls in, though they did still keep a few out, and they points adjusted some others, and so on and so forth. Whatever. It's fine. That's one specific independent tournament, right? But what it did is it kicked off this discussion. Second point is, these armies are really hard to get a hold of now. I mean, some, elements of the Bretonnians, say like the Knights of the Realm, are still around and, not that impossible to find because there were so many printed. But, some of these armies, like a lot of the Tomb King units, are now pretty expensive on eBay in the secondhand market and such. So, because they're more rare, they're expensive and rarer, they're more rarely seen, and hence if you run into them and they're also good, people can have bad play experiences. Now, I'm not sure this is a new thing. Chaos Dwarves were like this for years. They were a super expensive, hyper, unique army that came out of Forge World, and people would run into them and not know what the heck they were looking at. So I'm not sure this is really a new concept, but, here we are, I guess. And if you thought it was a problem then with Chaos Dwarves, maybe you think this is a problem now. If you didn't then, maybe you don't now. I don't know. The third point is the most sort of problematic to me. And that is, some of their rules are just goofy. And I mean this in two ways. One, they literally have comedy goof rules printed on them. Because these were printed in the early days of Age of Sigmar, and they really didn't know, I think, what they were doing, to be completely honest. And, which is fine. They clearly were pivoting very hard and very fast, and, they thought these would be a good idea. Clearly, they've moved away from it. There we go. So, you have things like the Grail Knights where you're supposed to hold up a cup and say, for the lady, when you charge, or whatever. Okay. But they also just have some goofy rules. That is to say, not funny or comedy, just goofily written that kind of lead to bad play experiences. These scrolls represent a sort of different era in the game, and that is a real challenge, right? When you've got something that's so very distinct. And that does pose a problem because it creates this weird dissonance when you've got one person trying to have a bushier mustache or something. Now, admittedly, obviously, most people just sort of accept that these rules, they just get the rules that are on there for the most part. Okay. So those are the issues. And the question becomes then, what do we do about it? Well, I think there are some solutions. So let's walk through those. Potential solutions. So assuming you agree that these are a challenge, and as I said, maybe you don't think this is actually a problem, but just for the sake of argument, walk down this road with me, because as I said, there are many people who do think this is a problem, so I think it's worth addressing, because I think we can get to a win for everyone. So, assuming that you agree these are a challenge, I think there are 4 options for what we could do, and here's the first one. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. We could do nothing. And what I mean by that is literally that. We're actively doing nothing. But that doesn't mean nothing is the result. Over time, there would be some pain in here for a little while, for an indeterminate amount of time. But over time, new armies would come out, and the new hotness is always attractive, and the world would just kind of move on. It's the same thing that happened with other older armies that got discontinued, like the Dogs of War. Eventually, people just kind of stopped caring because we got too distant from it. And, you know, the new hotness is the new hotness. Even if it's not, I don't necessarily mean, like, rules-wise. I just mean, like, when new armies look really cool and are really compelling, people tend to pick them up and start playing them. You know, it's arguable whether Ironjaws are better than Tomb Kings. I would argue they're not right now. But that being said, a lot of people bought Ironjaws, and there's a lot of people playing Ironjaws because those models are sweet. And, you know, that's what happened. So, you know, the new Zinch release is another example, and, you know, more releases, if you're watching this in the future, I'm sure have come out that have also been really stunning, because most of these releases, let's be honest, in Age of Sigmar, with few exceptions, have been really great and really compelling. And so, you know, over time, this would kind of course correct. My issue is I think this is missing an opportunity. I think doing nothing, although in the long run it might solve the problem, I think you still have that period of pain is unnecessary. And I think we can actually use this opportunity to do something better. Okay? So let's talk about some other potential solutions. All right. Option 2 is we could overcost them, right? So what I mean by this is we could simply up the points enough to make them non-competitive, right? And that will make sure that these aren't played competitively. Now, we don't have to absolutely break them, right? Like, Necro Knights being 160 right now is probably too efficient for how good they are. That doesn't mean we have to make them 500 points, right? That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you could adjust them up to, like, some middle ground number, call it 240, call it something, that just makes them non-competitive, okay? Like, it's just, nobody would take them at tournaments because you can't build a competitive list with them anymore. Now, the problem is this will also hurt people who use points but just play casually. A lot of people in their casual games, myself included, use points just as a shorthand to balance with your friends and to make conversation easier. You know, let's do 1,500 points. Okay, cool. Right? Like, we don't worry too deeply about the rules for making super competitive armies. We just use it as shorthand because we're all busy and life is complicated and we don't have a lot of time to hang out outside the game. And so this is just a quick way to have armies ready and going when we get together, right? Rather than having a lengthy discussion or a back and forth setup. So, and I, again, Mr. Tomb King's owner, when we sit in that situation, would be hurt because suddenly one of my favorite armies is now really overcosted and I can't really play them in a fun way, even in a casual game anymore. So I'm really, really not a fan of this solution, and I've heard it bandied about, and I think it's a terrible solution. I really do. Like, I am soundly against this one. We could just remove them, right? They could be left out of the General's Handbook too. And tournaments could then say, okay, only the most recent General's Handbook is the legal one we're using for everything. So whatever the rules are, which, by the way, I suspect that bullet point will be true regardless, right? So when tournaments are using General's Handbook rules, I suspect that they will go to simply using the most recent one, because it will have different rules clarifications, cleaner scenarios, won't require the FAQs, which will have probably been integrated and all that sort of thing, right? But my issue is this wouldn't really solve the problem. Those legacy points are still there, right? And they'd still remain and cause questions. And what you would see is people backporting in those old scrolls. Because once you've made something, we can't put Pandora back in the box here, is my ultimate point. So for people who say like, let's just get rid of them, I don't even know what that means. If you leave them out, I still have a copy of the General's Handbook that has the points, right? And theoretically, they could still be in Scroll Builder or in anything else. And just because you removed them from the most recent book, and yes, this would allow tournament organizers to solve the problem, it would still then cause a bunch of discussions of like, well, I want to play my Tomb Kings. Well, they're not the most recent book. Well, yeah, but I've still got the points. Can I play them? Well, those points were undercosted then. You shouldn't play them anymore, right? And it's just going to, what a hullabaloo. For no reason, right? Like, this doesn't need to exist in that format. Because I think ultimately I'm against this one as well, because this is a half measure toward what I think is the right answer. And that's on the next slide. The right answer is formats. Okay? So, in the late 90s, Magic was faced with a serious problem. Old out-of-print cards were winning tournaments, creating dominant decks, and dividing the community. Specifically here, what I mean is in the transition between beta and unlimited in the early phase of the game and revised, which was like the first big massively printed set, they got rid of a series of cards. Namely, they got rid of the Moxes, Black Lotus, the Power Blue, so Ancestral Recall, and these sorts of things. Time Walk. And as well as some other cards had just been out of print for a while that were quite powerful from things like Arabian Nights and Antiquities and things. So the point being is that there were these cards that were so good that Magic had gotten rid of them and replaced them with other things that they thought were better. But they still existed. You cannot put Pandora back in the box. And these cards were just dominating. Like, if you had two players of equal skill, and one of them had a deck with a Power 9, and one of them did not, the Power 9 player was probably walking away with the W. Not all the time, but most of the time. Because they were just incredible accelerants. Now, I don't think we have that kind of a situation with Warhammer, to be very clear. But the parallels are striking. In response, they created Type 1 and Type 2. Okay? Now, these have morphed over time into the funny little joke on the right, which is, they've morphed into Standard and Modern, which are what Type 1 or Type 2 evolved into, and Legacy and Vintage, which are what Type 1 evolved into. And these formats were basically structured like this. Type 1 was everything. Everything always. Now, there were still some restrictions, like you couldn't play more than one Mox Ruby or whatever, you were limited to one. So they still could restrict, but all the cards remained legal forever. Okay? And Type 2 said, what's legal is this floating, smaller subset that's a moving target. It stays with the most current sets. Okay? And to a point, they got more granular as the game evolved. And, but Standard is still very much that. It's the sort of the last two sets type of thing, basically. Not exactly, but basically. Modern is a longer time period, being a couple years worth of sets, going back several years. But still a moving target, right? Like, that is to say, next year, there will be different sets in Modern. The oldest ones will fall off, the newest ones will go in. Whereas Legacy and Vintage, the eternal formats, as it were, will always contain all of the cards in Magic. Now, there are nuances here, but don't worry about it. There are some small nuances that aren't relevant to our discussion. But the point being is that this sort of a distinction could be exactly the solution we need when faced with the Compendium scrolls. I would take a brief pause here to say, how did people react back in the 90s when Type 1 and Type 2 were announced. Did people see this as the brilliant masterstroke it has become? And by the way, it has. This saved Magic. It was the most successful, important change they ever made that has had the most positive effects on the game. Okay? And remains a beloved part of the game to this day because people have embraced these formats that are on the right and love to play in many different types of tournaments. Now, what's become, or what was thought of them at the time? Yeah, that. People hated this. Like, hated this beyond measure, okay? Just wrote Mark Rosewater, all these letters and everything, and emails and angry posts about how this is going to ruin the game. It's going to destroy Magic. That's it. Magic is over, people. Pack it up. Magic's over. Everybody go home. Magic's done. 1997. No more Magic. But of course that's nonsense. It's nonsense. Like, nerds hate change. Yeah. That's why. Nerds hate change. Hence why grognard, that term, was invented. Okay? But, of course, it wasn't the end of Magic. Again, as I said, it made it stronger and more successful. And it endures to this day as with an amazingly healthy competitive scene. Now, do Legacy and Vintage games get played as often as Standard and Modern? No, of course not. But that's because of the number of people who have those cards. There's less demand, right? The demand, sort of the supply shaped to the demand curve. But what I'll say is that there are still Legacy and Vintage tournaments at big, cons and events and gatherings and stuff like that, which is exactly where most people play tournaments now for Warhammer too, by the by. And the reality is I played in a ton of Legacy tournaments over the past 15 years, and I love them. Vintage is a bit out of my price range, but I do enjoy playing in Legacy tournaments. So these things still happen. It's not like by making this decision we would be banning anyone to necessarily a second-class citizen. We would just be openly admitting that there is a divide here and using it to our advantage instead of our disadvantage. My conclusion is this. The official formats would be a great way to handle what's likely a growing list of Compendium units over time. And it empowers TOs to say, this is going to be, and by the way, Type 1, Type 2, format name, I don't care. Call one Eternal or call one Modern, call whatever, I don't care. Whatever names you like. In fact, make cool names for them. Sounds fun. Warhammer Classic. I don't know. It doesn't really matter. But it gives TOs a powerful tool that they can build off of, because they can just put out their tournament pack and say, this is a Type 1 tournament, right? Hence, everything is allowed. And then what that means. There's a set of definitions that are unpacked from the mothership, from Games Workshop, about what this contains, right? But it's specifically relegated to be a tournament construction feature. And casual players can choose to just ignore this if they want, as I often do. I have a bunch of decks, some of which I build to format, that is to say, some of which I've built to standard format or modern format or whatever. Some of which I just go nuts with. I mean, technically, these decks are vintage decks, but they would never play in a vintage tournament. I just am using old cards, right? Like, I would get smashed in a heartbeat in any vintage tournament. It wouldn't even be, I wouldn't last until turn 2. But I still just want to use those old cards. And in my casual games with friends, they don't care, right? Because I'm just using old fun cards. The expectations are set accordingly. And we can use this terminology even in casual play. I can say, hey, I've got a standard deck. Do you have a fun standard deck you want to play? And then we play a fun standard game. See, once you introduce these terms, they become useful, even to casual people who don't really care about them, because they can ignore or utilize them as they see fit, right? And moreover, what I'm proposing here as formats is only the first use of this tool. Just as they did with Magic, initially they were there to solve a simple problem, or maybe not a simple problem, to solve a complex problem, I suppose. But they were there and introduced, and they were just these two things, type 1, type 2, very flat. But now over time they've evolved, and the idea of formats evolved, right? Because you got what was at a time called Elder Dragon Highlander evolve into be its own format in Commander, right? And so different ways to play the game evolved into their own unique format and have become very popular. There's no reason why we couldn't do that same thing with Warhammer. So you could have a skirmish level format that had official rules, and so on and so forth, right? And lots of different little formats could be released, some of which could become very popular, some of which not. They become a great sales tool for the company. Like, Commander has sold like gangbusters for Wizards, and people don't hate that. The people who love Commander love that they get so much support. And Commander has become incredibly popular, and it's a very weird, unusual format compared to how Magic used to be played. Very, very different. Yet people love it because it's a different way to experience the same sort of thing. And we could do the same thing here over time. We don't need to figure that all out at once. Let it happen organically. Over time, people can find some new ways to play, but by introducing the concept that you're allowed to do this, to structure these formats, you encourage people to also try these different ways. So I think there's huge benefits to this. I think it solves a problem. I still get my Tomb Kings. I still have what are fair points, and I can still use them. And if there's a tournament that doesn't want to use those particular things, I can know that because they can just write on there, this is a type 2 or whatever tournament, right? And I can say, okay, not the army for that one. But I can go hunt out the type 1 tournaments, and I can bring my TK list to that, right? So my short answer is there's nothing that's going to be a complete win-win, right? There's always going to be a little bit of problems with this. But I think this provides the most upside while minimizing the downside. And most importantly, most importantly, Cetra remains. Because as we all know, Cetra does not serve. He rules. So there you go, folks. That's my thoughts on compendiums. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that I at least gave you something to think about, even if I didn't convince you. But I'd love to hear your thoughts below. Don't forget to give it a like if you enjoyed it. Subscribe for more thoughts and hobby cheating and everything else we do here on the channel in the future. And, of course, share this. Please share this. That's always the nicest thing you can do. I deeply appreciate when people share my videos with others. And as always, we'll see you next time.